My husband shouted, "Let's get rid of the useless people in the family," and before the words even settled in the air, my parents laughed. Not nervously. Not in shock. They laughed like it was a joke they had been waiting to hear. Then came the line that cut deepest, "All you're good for is your money." We were standing in the living room, lights too bright, voices too loud, every face turned toward me. I remember the exact sound of that laughter, short, sharp, dismissive. I remember how my hands felt cold while my chest burned. No one defended me. No one corrected him. The silence afterward was louder than the shouting. In that moment, I understood the stakes clearly. This was not a fight. This was a verdict. Years of marriage, loyalty, and sacrifice were reduced to a single role I had apparently played well enough to be mocked. I did not cry. I did not argue. I looked at each of them, one by one, and realized something quietly powerful. They had just told me exactly who they thought I was, and exactly who they were to me. I had been the dependable one for as long as I could remember. The wife who handled the bills before anyone asked. The daughter who stepped in when money was tight and never mentioned it again. I learned early that being useful earned approval, and I mistook that approval for love. My husband used to praise my strength in public, but at home, that strength became expectation. If something broke, I fixed it. If someone needed help, I paid for it. Slowly, my value stopped being emotional and became transactional. I noticed it in small moments, the way conversations paused when I entered, then resumed without including me. The way my opinions were acknowledged with a nod, then ignored. My parents were no different. They called when they needed support, not connection. I told myself this was normal. Families rely on each other. Marriage is teamwork. I repeated those ideas until they sounded true. But there were patterns I could no longer ignore. Decisions made without me. Jokes at my expense disguised as honesty. Gratitude replaced by entitlement. When I hesitated, even briefly, I was reminded of everything I owed. Inside, I carried a quiet exhaustion. Not the kind that makes you collapse, but the kind that makes you observant. I began to notice how rarely anyone asked how I was doing, and how often they assumed I would say yes. By the time my husband shouted those words, they were not new. They were simply spoken out loud for the first time. And once they were spoken, I could not unhear them. After that night, nothing changed on the surface. That was the most unsettling part. Life continued as if no line had been crossed, as if words like useless and only good for your money were normal language inside a family. My husband spoke to me the next morning in the same flat tone, asking if I had paid the credit card bill. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply assumed my role would resume. At family gatherings, the insults became quieter, almost elegant. A pause before my name. A look exchanged across the table when I spoke. My mother would smile tightly and say, "You're so practical," the way someone compliments a tool. My father cleared his throat whenever the topic of finances came up, then looked at me without saying my name, as if the responsibility floated naturally in my direction. My husband started making decisions without me. He booked trips I was expected to fund but not attend fully. He discussed plans with my parents while I sat beside him, present but invisible. When I asked questions, the room went still for half a second too long, then someone would change the subject. There were no raised voices. No dramatic scenes. Just a steady erosion. 1,000 small moments that told the same story. My presence was useful, not valued. I watched carefully. The way laughter stopped when I stopped paying for something. The way warmth returned the moment I agreed again. That contrast stayed with me. And in that quiet observation, tension built, not outward, but inward, where decisions are made. The turning point did not come during an argument. It arrived on an ordinary afternoon, while I was reviewing bank statements at the kitchen table. Line after line carried my name, my signature, my responsibility. Mortgages. Transfers. Emergency payments that were never emergencies to anyone but me. My husband walked past, glanced at the papers, and said, almost casually, "Make sure the account stays healthy. We might need it." He did not sit down. He did not ask how I was doing. He spoke like someone checking the fuel gauge of a car he assumed would always run. That was the moment. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just undeniable. I realized then that nothing I did would ever be enough, because enough was not the goal. Access was. As long as I stayed useful, I would stay tolerated. The instant I stopped, I would be disposable. So I stopped explaining. I stopped filling the silence. I stopped rescuing. I separated accounts quietly, methodically. I met with a financial advisor under the excuse of long-term planning. I reviewed contracts I had signed without thinking twice. Everything I did was legal, reasonable, and invisible to anyone not looking closely. There was no risk in this decision. Only clarity. The action itself was not the climax. The success was internal. The moment I chose myself without announcing it, I felt something settle. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. For the first time in years, I slept without anxiety. Not because my problems were solved, but because I finally understood them. And once you understand the game, you stop playing it blindly. I approached it the way I approached everything else in my life, calmly, with facts and structure. Years of managing finances had taught me how systems work, and more importantly, how they fail when one person quietly steps away. I did not rush. I mapped everything out. First came the paperwork. I consulted a lawyer, not to threaten anyone, but to understand my rights. Marital assets. Shared liabilities. What was legally mine, and what I was merely maintaining for others. The answers were sobering, but empowering. I had more control than anyone realized. Next, I adjusted my finances with precision. Separate accounts. Automatic payments rerouted. Contributions reduced to what was legally required, nothing more. I documented every transaction, every agreement, every pattern. Not out of spite, but out of responsibility to myself. Socially, I became quieter. I stopped announcing plans. I declined gatherings where I was treated like an open wallet. When asked why, I said nothing beyond, "I'm focusing on myself." People tend to reveal their intentions when you do not over-explain. My husband noticed changes, but misread them as temporary moods. My parents assumed I would correct course, the way I always had. That assumption became my advantage. There was no confrontation. No dramatic declaration. Just preparation layered over time. Smart revenge does not need witnesses. It needs patience. By the time anyone sensed a shift, the structure had already changed. I was no longer the foundation holding everything up. I was standing on my own ground, steady and untouchable. The execution was almost invisible. That was the beauty of it. Nothing exploded. Nothing collapsed overnight. I simply stopped compensating for what others refused to carry. The first sign appeared quietly. A bill went unpaid, not because I forgot, but because it was never mine to manage. I watched from a distance as confusion replaced certainty. My husband frowned at his phone, recalculating, rereading. He did not accuse me. Not yet. He assumed a delay, a mistake. At the next family gathering, I arrived empty-handed. No envelope. No quiet transfer made afterward. Conversation stumbled for a moment, like music skipping a beat, then recovered awkwardly. I noticed how quickly warmth cooled when generosity did not follow me into the room. Weeks passed. Pressure built, not loudly, but steadily. Requests were phrased carefully now. My name spoken with hesitation. My husband started asking questions he had never needed to ask before. Where was the money? Why did accounts feel tighter? I answered calmly. Factually. That is not my responsibility anymore. No anger. No explanation beyond that. The consequences unfolded on their own. Plans were cancelled. Assumptions failed. My parents realized support was not automatic. My husband realized control had been mistaken for partnership. What satisfied me most was not their discomfort, but my composure. I sat in the same rooms, heard the same voices, and felt nothing twist inside me anymore. The power shift was subtle, but irreversible. They had taken my silence for permission. I let them discover, quietly, that it was never the same thing. The fallout was slower than I expected, but it was inevitable. My husband's frustration grew, tempered by confusion. He no longer assumed I would fix every problem, every family crisis. My parents stopped calling first, hesitating as if unsure whether I would answer. Even my siblings, who had always relied on my compliance, began calculating their requests. At first, I felt a quiet tension. Dinners were awkward. Casual questions came with an edge, every conversation weighted. I could see the disbelief in my husband's eyes when I declined to lend money, and in my parents when I refused to arbitrate their disputes. No yelling, no dramatic confrontations, just the reality of boundaries firmly in place. My reputation shifted. To some, I was difficult, maybe even cold. But to others, especially friends and colleagues who had long seen me undervalued, I became someone who finally demanded respect. My self-worth, once tied to how much I could do for others, no longer hinged on their approval. Audience, this is why it matters. Smart, silent revenge is not about cruelty. It is about reclaiming your life, your choices, and your dignity. You do not need to scream to make a point. You do not need to punish to prevail. The natural consequences, the subtle shift of power, speak louder than words ever could. And when they finally realized I would no longer be their default solution, the lesson landed, not with rage, but with clarity. I had taken my life back, quietly, smartly, and irreversibly. The quiet that followed was unlike anything I had felt before, peaceful, controlled, and deeply satisfying. I no longer measured my worth by how much I could be used, borrowed from, or leaned on. My boundaries, once ignored, were now respected, not because I demanded it with anger, but because I showed consistency and calm resolve. That, I realized, was the true power of silent revenge. It was not the act itself, but the shift it caused in the world around me. I began investing in myself, time, energy, and love that had always been diverted to placating others. My work flourished without the constant interference of family obligations. Friendships deepened, strengthened by the respect I finally commanded. Even my husband, once arrogant and dismissive, started to see me in a new light, not as a resource to exploit, but as a partner who could stand firm without losing warmth. Looking forward, I no longer feared being taken for granted. I knew my parents and siblings would continue to navigate their lives with their own choices, but I would no longer be a default for their convenience. I had earned the right to my own story, my own priorities, and my own happiness. And in that space, I found something I had never had before: freedom. Freedom from the constant expectation to give, fix, or endure. Freedom to live deliberately, with quiet strength and measured justice. I smiled as I realized it finally. Revenge, when done with intelligence and patience, isn't about punishment. It's about reclaiming yourself. And that was my victory.